We're going to talk about the evidence review, and the first thing I'm going to do this morning is to hand over to the systematic review authors, Dylan Neal and Mukjarat Bangpang. They're going to talk you through the evidence that they've gathered and the findings. And then we're going to go to Carl Wilding from Berry Green Partners, who's going to talk about the work he's been helping us conduct, which consists of a policy overview and a policy briefing. So we've been trying to put the evidence that we've gathered in the context of policy narratives and the policy landscape, and to try and make sense of it as a result of doing that. We're then going to have a quick Q&A session with Angela Salt, Chief Executive of Girl Guiding. And then we're going to come to you for Q&A. We have a lot to get through in the next hour, so I'm going to hand straight over to Dylan Neal, who's going to talk us through the findings from the review that he and Mukjarat have been doing. Dylan.
Yeah, welcome to this session where we're going to be sharing the findings from our review, rapid realist systematic review on looking at the mechanisms which enabled groups, communities and agencies to step up and mobilise during the pandemic. So this is work that I've been conducting, Mukjarat and I have been conducting with co-authors Catherine Hartley and Mei Hui Hu, but also we want to acknowledge the support of past roundtable participants as well, who've been really helpful in helping us make sense of the literature. So thank you for that. And so just to give a bit of background, so this review formed on the basis of observations around informal volunteering increasing during the pandemic. So, for example, we saw over 750,000 people signing up to NHS England's call for volunteers in just 4 days in April 2020, but also a rise in people working together, a rise in people power. And we saw that over 4,000 mutual aid groups were registering as providing support locally during the pandemic. And we saw that people were working together in a way that was either extending existing groups and organisations to help and stepping up to help, and also those who were emerging and who were responding to a real perceived need for help, but may not have led to kind of more ongoing formal organisation. And just the background of the pandemic as well was that it exposed the depth of inequalities across multiple dimensions. So this review did take into account a lot of the equity considerations as well around volunteering. And so for our core question for the Rapid Realist review, where we're really focused on mechanisms, we were interested in what were the core mechanisms for mobilising volunteers for local groups and communities and organisations during the COVID-19 pandemic, and under what circumstances, where and among whom do these mechanisms occur. We were particularly interested in the way that volunteers were recruited, what the barriers and facilitators were to engaging volunteers, whether some of the processes of engaging volunteers were inclusive or exclusive to particular groups or communities, and whether we needed to take into account any other equity issues that may arise from mobilising volunteers. So we conducted this rapid realist review. We're really interested in mechanisms in this review, and a mechanism is a shorthand way of describing how a change happens between an input and an outcome. And these mechanisms are real, but they're usually challenging to directly observe. And we were considering mechanisms emerging at different ecological levels, from individuals through to agencies and organisations, to communities and broader social systems. And we expected that the same mechanism would operate at different levels, different ecological levels, and trigger different outcomes. And what we were particularly interested in was trying to identify which context these mechanisms occurred in. And for context, we were particularly interested in equity issues as a context, and then thinking about which outcomes those mechanisms generated. And the focus on mechanisms was really intended to illuminate some of the processes, and we wanted to understand these processes because we thought the processes themselves would be generalizable across different settings. So we developed a theory of sorts to begin with, and this is kind of what we expected to find at the outset. And if you can almost, I'll just talk through one part of the theory. So here we had volunteers arriving with different volunteer capital, so different expectations and experiences and socio-demographic characteristics. And we expected that a mechanism for activating stepping up and mobilizing during the pandemic was this gaining experience and identifying with the role of becoming a volunteer, which we expected would lead to better well-being outcomes among volunteers and also activate a cycle where once volunteers started taking on the role, it'd be this kind of self-fulfilling role, but it would be a virtuous cycle. They'd continue to do more volunteering. We drew on evidence from 59 different studies, and the majority from the UK, but we had evidence coming from a lot of different high-income countries, from Singapore through to the United States. A quarter of the studies focused on studies on healthcare workers who volunteered during the pandemic, and a lot of the literature came from grey literature, so unpublished, non-peer-reviewed literature, but actually in this review, that type of literature provided the greatest depth and some of the most comprehensive accounts around volunteering. So we've identified 6 mechanisms, so we're going to talk through them individually now. So the first mechanism was around developing role identity through gaining experience. And we thought that this mechanism linked with the following outcomes. We thought that people who developed role identity through gaining experience develop their confidence, volunteers would develop their skills and knowledge, would experience personal development, and would be encouraged to volunteer again in the future. It would be this kind of virtuous cycle, and then would improve their well-being as well. And so for each of these mechanisms and outcomes, we developed this context mechanism outcome configuration. So we've got an example here for confidence. So when volunteers are able to complete new tasks or draw on existing volunteer capital, that's the context, they gain or solidify their role identity as volunteers. That's the mechanism which helps to raise their level of confidence and feelings of empowerment. And we had 18 studies supporting this mechanism in total. And so for the different outcomes, we can see different evidence supporting the CMO, the context mechanism outcome configuration. So for example, we saw that developing role identity and gaining experience allow people to develop their professional skills. So for example, a report from Badger here, one of the participants reported that there were fewer restrictions when learning as a volunteer compared to their previous experiences, and it allowed the volunteers to get more involved and become increasingly comfortable in their roles. We also saw that the pandemic challenged volunteers to carry out new duties, which helped to solidify their role identity and saw volunteers grow personally. It created this virtuous cycle, so people were able to go out and volunteer more in the future. And then also it helped to trigger improvements in well-being as well. So for example, we've got a quote here from Cooney and McCashin. This is a study looking at the Samaritans in Ireland during the pandemic. And we could see a quote here from a volunteer. It's the isolation and loneliness, but from the point of view of even going in to see it and be there, it actually took you away from, because you're actually doing something, the isolation, loneliness, away as you have possibly been impacted by it, it actually took it away because you're actually going in there and being in there. So the kind of volunteer in this case really emphasizing that helping and being part of the response was really a key factor in helping to offset the risk of isolation and loneliness in their case. We also saw a mechanism around supporting volunteers, and support took on different forms. So support could involve providing material support. It was also around providing emotional support for volunteers, helping volunteers feel part of the team in carrying out their duties, and supporting volunteers in the sense of providing support through suitable training and management. And so we'll talk through those a little bit again. So we saw that volunteers who felt supported reported better psychosocial outcomes, which may have far-reaching implications. And we saw that with processes and systems were put into place that helped volunteers to understand and acknowledge the role and the difference that they were making in the role, and to provide instrumental support if that was needed, helped to incentivize more sustained patterns of volunteering and could potentially broaden the profile of the volunteering workforce. So you've got a quote here from a participant who was reflecting on their volunteering experience and thinking about their social profile compared to the broader population, if you like. And then you've also got this quote here, a quote from Mao and colleagues. So, oh yeah, I've had lovely texts from people saying, you know, you've really made such a difference, you know, that you fix my anxiety. I've been really worried. I've not been able to sleep knowing that I've not been getting my food and my prescription. And yeah, just little texts like that, and knowing that you've made a difference has been amazing. So supporting volunteers to recognize the difference that they're making was a key mechanism here in sustaining that contribution. And we've also linked support as well with better quality. But we also support operating at a community level, where volunteers were supporting each other in more mutual roles and supporting community members through mutuality. And we saw that supporting volunteers at a community level could be interpreted as a form of activism, so support as a form of activism in this case. So when communities were in need, social activism was a form of support that galvanized communities to step in where the government was unable and willing, to ensure that community members were provided with basic essentials. And you've got a quote here from a study by Chevy that really emphasizes that some of these mutual aid groups saw themselves as standing very much apart from existing infrastructure in this case. And then our third mechanism focuses on altruism. So supporting this mechanism, we had 15 studies, and this mechanism is a little bit more straightforward. It's around the existential threat that COVID-19 posed, helped to engender a sense of collective unity that developed into more altruistic motivations and a sense of duty, which then mobilized large numbers of people to volunteer during the pandemic. And we've got a quote here to support this mechanism, and this was supported as well by 15 studies. I'm going to hand over to Muktara now, who's going to close the presentation.
Thank you, Dylan. So for the fourth mechanism emerged from the literature is about adaptability. We found evidence across ecological models, so at individual, agency, and social system levels in terms of how they adapt their work, change the ways they mobilize volunteers, and or how they adjust the routine practice to provide services and support in responding to the rapid change during the pandemic. For example, at the individual level, evidence found that the volunteers changed the ways they normally delivered services in order to meet the urgent needs of service users. This new way of working often involves using new technology, moving services from face-to-face to online, or using new digital devices or applications to manage or deliver services. But at the same time, there are concerns for some disadvantaged groups. For example, the elderly or people with long-term health conditions. around barriers to access to these new online services, or volunteer concerns about they able to how they can access to online service. Some because they're not confident in their digital skills. Some who live in remote areas, they're concerned about their internet connections, which is sometimes not reliable. For organizational level, adaptability often refers to, again, finding new ways of working and again using new technology to deliver services, but also about ability to identify new services that quickly respond to the needs during the pandemic. For example, many organizations and mutual aid groups were able to provide new services such as driving, shopping, delivery, food during the lockdown. And these new services also seen as open up the new opportunity to recruit and engage with new volunteers. Another finding at this level of organizations, agency were about adapt their volunteer management processes by empowering volunteers making decisions, let them making decisions about when and where they can work, particularly for those who have commitments such as childcare or working full-time. And this could potentially improve satisfaction and motivation for volunteering. At policy level, the evidence we found so far suggests that the way the policies can change quickly, particularly around financial support from the government, such as the furlough scheme, could create new opportunities for volunteering. Next slide, please. The fifth mechanism is about coordination. We see here systems, policy, actions across within and across different levels of society, facilitating working together, which could help, for example, mobilizing volunteers more effectively, and they might identify new ways of working, also help to address the issues around duplications and use resources more effectively. For example, the coordination between local governments and local communities could help to identify demands and service during the time of the pandemic, which could avoid duplication efforts in terms of providing, offering service at that time. And then another dimension of coordination is about sharing and disseminating accurate, relevant, timely information. This issue is discussed in studying focusing on volunteer passports in terms of benefits from information sharing to match volunteer skills with available opportunities and quickly access to a wider pool of volunteers. For coordination, evidence is seen in the context of proactive efforts in setting up and running mutual aid groups and also among community groups. And also we see the link to the concept of trust and leadership in shaping of how coordination could influence the outcomes. Next page, please. The last mechanism is about trust and sense of community. We see how we consider how trust and sense of community can influence the way in which support and services were delivered during the pandemic. There is a recognition of in terms of the challenges for building trust and create sense of community in which, very often require times and collective efforts between partners. So pre-existing relationships can create space to build trust and in turn could help to identify available resources quickly in the time of crisis. There was also some kind of among volunteer sense of community during the pandemic, which would in turn, bring people together to respond to the urgent need during the pandemic. At the same time, some suggested that lack of trust, lack of local relationships could be seen as barriers to scaling up the efforts to respond to higher demands for services during the pandemic as well. Within this trust and sense of community, the evidence so far were found to be around the context of work delivered or managed by mutual aid groups and local community groups. Next slide, please. So we also identify equity concerns across 6 mechanisms, including around place, language, occupation, socioeconomic status, and social capital. Particularly, as many services were largely moved from face-to-face to online platform, there are real concerns of how people such as we discussed, the elderly, people with long-term conditions with disabilities might be excluded and are unable to access new service online. Another concern is around place, where people work and live. For example, people who live in rural places, deprived areas, may have challenges in terms of connecting with others, as infrastructure such as internet connection, transportation may not well developed or may be not reliable, or they may face extra cost or time for traveling. And lastly, there is a question of how to provide adequate and appropriate material and psychological support to people who really want to volunteer but have limited resources and skill. So how we can provide them so they have opportunities for volunteering. And as we discussed in our report that we will send to you the link later on, there are some limitations for this work, for our work. For example, our work includes the research during the pandemic published from 2020. So future research in this area could provide further insights and lessons learned for more long-term outlook on recovery phase after the pandemic. As the result in our review are largely based on qualitative literature, we only assess the quality in terms of relevancy in addressing the research questions. At the end, we also provide some recommendations that may help to mobilize and sustain volunteering in future. For example, to consider ways to develop a better systems to matching volunteers, considering reconceptualizing volunteers as an opportunity to develop skills, competencies as part of their personal goals, career development, and also increasing public familiarity with volunteers. So offering something like a test session, open day, so they have a quick experience of how volunteering experience looks like. And finally, future research. We recommend that could aim to understand and explore effective policy and interventions, how to remove barriers to volunteering, and again to understand further how volunteering could be sustained and understood as a mutual beneficial community-based approach. That's it for us, and we can take questions later. Thank you.
Muggerat and Dylan, thank you so much for that very clear and concise overview of the work you've done. The point of the International Public Policy Observatory is to create this rigorous evidence base to inform the development and implementation of policy. So we want everything we do to be done in the context of an understanding of the policy landscape and the policy narratives that exist in different areas. And I'm now going to turn to Carl Wilding, who's just going to tell us a bit about the work that he's helped us with in creating an understanding of that policy context and using that to refine some of the recommendations. Carl.
Hi, everyone. So I'd like to begin by almost framing my contribution by reminding us that I think we've got to be realistic about what can actually be done by policymakers to shift the dial on, certainly on levels of volunteering, because it sort of strikes me that that volunteering over the long term is relatively static. And there's some evidence, I think, that previous initiatives, of which many of you on this call will be familiar with, that they've struggled to bear fruit. Second, I think we also have to remember that we are still in a period where how people are getting involved is changing, with, I think, some evidence that people are less prepared to commit. They're more interested in short-term task-based activities rather than long-term relational activities. So I think there's a challenge here for policymakers that the sorts of volunteering that they often want might not be the sorts of volunteering that they're likely to get. But I do think we should be optimistic about the fact that people still respond to need when they see it, whether it's about giving time or money. So I guess my question for the conversation is this a discussion that's about mobilization, where we frame the problem as a situation where people need to be inspired or activated, to use that old public policy word, or whether the problem is more about a question of infrastructure and support, or at times of emergency, a question of better coordination. So these are issues about the quantity of volunteering and the quality of volunteering. When you look at the policy options that have been adopted in various countries, we've come up with 5 themes, and I think that these are pretty common around the world, so there's no light bulb moments, I'm afraid, for you here. I think if I was going to reflect on them, it would be that I think for policymakers, you have to think about the role of policy during peacetime in terms of preparedness, not just the role of policy during the emergency period, where I think the demands on policymakers and how they might act are potentially different. And indeed, Mukhtar has highlighted already the fact that COVID created specific conditions that aren't going to be there necessarily in future. So 5 areas where policymakers might think about involvement. So first is around leadership and the development of volunteering strategy. I worry with talking about leadership that sometimes it seems a bit of panacea, that you sprinkle some leadership on whatever problem that you've got and everything's going to be okay. But it strikes me that in terms of how governments think about volunteering, there are some quite different approaches. So in Scotland, for example, where you have the National Outcomes Framework for volunteering, and that's linked into the outcomes of government as a whole, there's obviously a lot of thinking about what volunteering is for, about why governments want people to get involved in their communities. And that strikes me that having that sort of layer in place is important. And then when you move on to the actual period of crisis, the pandemic, again, being really clear about about how you see the role of volunteering and how you see the role of communities in terms of sort of getting engaged. And I think there were different levels of readiness in there. The second links to what we've sort of just heard already, which is thinking differently about volunteering and about what the role of policy and practice is in terms of shaping what you might call more inclusive or flexible opportunities. Because as we well know, those opportunities to get involved aren't distributed equally. Now, in some cases, that's about flexibility in terms of people's lives. And one of the policy suggestions, for example, in the past has been putting volunteering on a par with being a school governor or jury service, where that means that they've got more flexibility around their roles. In COVID, we saw more flexibility in terms of NHS responders, and a big scheme that was developed around task-based volunteering, which in many respects was a success. But there's flexibility in terms of organisations as well. And one of the things that came back from the literature was the idea that where volunteer involving organisations have got flexible funding and resources, it's much easier for them in turn to create flexible opportunities for volunteering. So we have to think about, for example, more grant-based approaches to funding organisations rather than contracts. Fourthly, and I think this is a particularly important one, it's about the role of policy in terms of strengthening support and infrastructure for volunteering. And I think that's particularly important at the local level. I guess I worry from a policy perspective that there's too much emphasis on filling the volunteering hopper, that we just want to get more people all the time, when actually there should be more emphasis on retention, not just recruitment. So for me, that's about committing resources to volunteer management, for example, and ensuring that there is a good quality volunteering experience by, for example, modernising the administration of volunteering by investing in digital. As you've heard already, there's been a lot of interest in passport schemes. I think I'm a bit more cautious about this, because if for no other reason, what a passport scheme means is different to different people. And certainly there's a worry that if you develop, for example, national schemes, that these might crowd out some quite successful local schemes. What I'd also add in here in terms of policy options around strengthening support and infrastructure is, again, it's not just what you can do in terms of what happens during a crisis. It's about creating the conditions more generally for a strong local infrastructure where you understand local needs and indeed where you understand local assets as well. Fifthly, I think policymakers have a role in terms of recognising and celebrating the value of volunteering. And I guess in here you bring in issues around reward. So at the moment, you probably know that there's a consultation by the UK Commission on COVID commemoration about how we, and one of the potential responses to that is how we might recognise the role of volunteers. I talked about reward a moment ago. One of the things that has come up already this morning is thinking about expenses and how do we make that aspect of volunteering a little bit easier for some people. Again, I think this is interesting, but I think we need to be cautious. Those who get into policy detail here will know that HMRC, for example, will have plenty of concerns around what we do there. But there potentially is more to do, and the example at the moment of volunteer drivers and how they're recompensed for travel costs is an example. And then the sixth recommendation is about better coordination and dialogue between volunteer involving organisations. And I think certainly what we saw during COVID were quite a lot of tension between the national and the local, and some of that came from not very good information sharing, certainly from sort of the central to the local at times. And we certainly saw examples during the emergency, such as Volunteer Edinburgh's wiki page about how information sharing can unblock some of the things that we saw. So I think the lessons from COVID for policymakers are that people will mobilise. They respond to need when they see it. But we then have to ensure that we can help to create opportunities that match where, how, and when they want to get involved. And then from looking at the various policy initiatives over a number of years, it's my sense that rather than thinking about new or innovative policy, we probably will be better spending more time by learning from what works. Thanks, everyone.
Many thanks, Carl. That was really helpful, and I hope will give people a sense of how we're trying to join the dots between the evidence and the policy. We are very fortunate to have with us today Angela Salt, who is CEO of Girl Guiding UK, and of course is a vastly experienced leader in the field, and enormously experienced in the area of volunteering. So I'd like to ask you a couple of questions, Angela, if that's okay. From your perspective as an experienced leader in the field, I'd first like to ask you a question about the sort of legacy of developments that happened during COVID-19. Obviously, it was a really important moment in terms of volunteering. Do you think that some of the developments that we saw during the pandemic will have a lasting impact, and what might they be?
Thanks, Jo. It's fast. I'm kind of distracted as well by all that we've heard and learned in the paper. I come at it from a practical point of view, and Girl Guiding has a particular practice of volunteering. So I've also worked with the voluntary service overseas. So that's overseas volunteering, and for example, on the London Olympics, that was different. Girl Guiding's model is regular and with children, and part of a, if you like, a historic organisation. So yes, I lived through it and led the organisation and worked very closely with a number of other chief execs who also lead large volunteering organisations. We have about 70,000 volunteers across the UK in a kind of hierarchical structure, working with about 24,000 units of girls and young women. So I think the pandemic was a huge thing for us. A huge thing for me. I hadn't been in the role and just figured out what we needed to do, and then the pandemic hit. So I think the first thing we did was we needed to suspend face-to-face, which is like the heart of what we do and hadn't been suspended since the Second World War. And so we changed, we pivoted quite quickly in a matter of weeks to some online guiding, which a common phrase during the pandemic was how organisations managed to do things in weeks that normally took months. So I think that was a lasting effect, that you could actually deliver some of your services online. And we've kept some of that. However, I mean, at the heart of what we do, and I think much of, but not all of volunteering is face-to-face. So I think that will last. I think there were some interesting gendered implications during the pandemic, which are always there for us. So, for example, about 40% of our volunteers are key workers, and they were in a position, I think, where you find that more caring responsibilities, and so less availability to volunteer. And I think there were some people, including in Girl Guiding, the pandemic caused this big change in life priorities for many people. So some people haven't come back into volunteering who used to do volunteering beforehand. So I think that's another lasting impact. So there's some of the digitization, some of the actual change. I think there was that mass mobilisation, and worked closely with Catherine Johnson and the RVS, Royal Voluntary Society at the time, and they used that app. And I think it was a sort of almost like an Uber experience, wasn't it? In the sense, as Carl was saying, it was quite transactional, really, where you could choose what you wanted to do, where you wanted to do it, when you wanted to do it, how you wanted to do it. And you got the satisfaction, I think, that often comes with volunteering and is a driver, I think, for volunteering, of feeling and believing and actually achieving something. So I think that sort of transactional nature, if you like, has a lot of implications, particularly for organisations like Girl Guiding, which has a very different model and absolutely relies for delivery on regularity, being in a particular place at a particular time, and looking after children. So I think, yes, there's some big implications from the pandemic, and they were just three really that we particularly experienced.
That's fascinating. I just wanted to ask you one more question, Angela. I just so linking back to the work we've been hearing about earlier this morning, are there things which really jump out at you from the work we've done? Issues from the evidence review, from the policy review, which seem particularly pertinent to you and important?
Absolutely, and in fact, this weekend, and one of our colleagues is on the call, we were at a couple of hundred of our volunteers who are sort of, if you like, our middle management from across the UK. We have been for a while, although perhaps that's not felt experience, been working on flexible volunteering and rewarding volunteering. It's a key priority for us as an organisation last year, this year. We want to be the place to volunteer, and to some extent we're all in competition with each other, aren't we, for volunteers. Our volunteers do come to us for different reasons around a third of the UK population at some point was involved in Girl Guide in one way or the other. We want to give that rewarding and flexible volunteering, and I think that's really important. So our systems and processes need to be like that, I think. I think there are structural things that we can do, and one of the things that I think is worth considering and influencing government on is paid volunteer leave. I mean, some of the big organisations have it, we have it, but I think actually that paid leave sends a very strong signal, and many organisations give you paid for leave for certain purposes, and why not volunteering? But I think that certainly the flexibility and creating a rewarding and flexible model is very important to us, and I suspect important to most people on this call, because it requires quite a different approach, I think, from the organisation which is behind, giving the opportunities for volunteering.
Thank you, Angela. And I guess that emphasis on creating flexibility gels well with what you said earlier about the transactional model and how important that might become to the future of volunteering. Thank you very much. I'd now like to come back to our participants. Participants who've been putting things in the chat, I can see, but do raise your hand also if you have things that you'd like to comment on, or questions you'd like to ask of anyone you've heard from this morning. So I can see a couple actually of questions from Dega Camarada. Was there some evidence of to what extent these mechanisms were particular to the situation of the pandemic, and to what extent they were the same mechanisms that operate in more ordinary times? So Dylan Mukhtarat, maybe you could come back to that question. Oh, you come back to that question, Dylan. Just give voice to that answer.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good question. And we were kind of dealing exclusively with literature that was focused on the pandemic. And I think that three of the mechanisms in particular were very reflective of the context of the pandemic. So the importance of coordination and that kind of scramble at the beginning to kind of mobilise people, and that coordination helping to avoid duplication of efforts. Altruism, which we saw kind of operating more on an individual level, but during the pandemic as well, being operationalized at a more kind of public and kind of almost like a cultural level, a social level, and then adaptability as well being particularly important. And as we've been discussing, that shift to online services and being able to be kind of flexible and nimble. So I think they're applicable to ordinary times as well, but had particular ways of being operationalized and particular resonance, I guess, during the pandemic. Those three ones.
Great, thanks, Dylan. Gabby Pollard from Victim Support, keen to get others' views on how to mobilise older volunteers through the digital divide, e.g. did virtual volunteering without giving everyone a computer, basically. Are there alternatives to giving everyone a computer? Come in, anyone with thoughts on that? Maybe I could come to Angela actually for your thoughts on that.
I think our demographic is probably 50 plus women, and I think so. I think the digital poverty is a real issue, I think, for us and most organisations as well, in terms of how much do you put online and how much do you put face to face. I think at the heart we are face to face and would encourage that. But I think there's a broad range of things that you can do as a volunteer in our organisation and other organisations that don't require necessarily digital expertise or aspects. So I guess it's just to be clear, if what you've got to offer I think that's the important point, is being really clear on the offer that you have as an organisation in terms of how much that's digital or not, and then also about how much you enable the volunteers as well. You know, what opportunities they have for learning and development. We have that as one of our key offers to volunteers as well. I think in terms of the question here about how you make your roles more flexible, and you're at the Mix, are you? So yeah, that's a Millennium project back when I worked there. So I think it is difficult to be flexible with some of the offers, but I think a team approach is really important. And so what happens in a lot of our places is that you have a small group who are actually delivering as well. So I think that kind of flexibility can be good, and the support that you put in offer. But in terms of things like the helpline, I suppose that ties in a little bit with the previous question as well, that some volunteering can actually be very flexible nowadays because of, for example, you might be able to deliver it on the phone as well. But being, I think, clear about your offer and going back to the research, being really supportive, understanding what your volunteers need and trying to be supportive of them, they're the most important aspects, I think.
Great, thank you. Carl, you've noted that the Tory manifesto of 2015 had a commitment to paid leave to volunteer, paid volunteering leave. It never got implemented. But others have also noted in the chat that a good number of organisations, including the civil service, do commit to paid volunteering leave. I wonder, Carl, if you want to just come back to us with a few thoughts on where are we with that commitment? Do you see it's an area that more organisations are committing to, or less? That idea that people should have time to do volunteering.
Certainly in terms of the political commitment, I don't think that's gone anywhere, and I think they had quite a bit of pushback against that. I think it was seen as a business burden, just as the same way that I think proposals for a bank holiday style arrangement for volunteering are also seen as a burden. If I might be sort of provocative for a moment, I think some of how this sort of goes forward, it depends upon your perspective of what are the barriers and opportunities. So if you think that a lack of time, which is often given as an excuse for why people don't volunteer, is the reason, then these sorts of interventions are going to work. But then there's another perspective, which is if you look at there's some work being done on the time use survey, which highlights that over a long period of time, it looks like volunteering is less enjoyable. And then you've got other things from ONS that sort of say that actually volunteering is competing for time with other leisure activities like multimedia and so on. So is it a question of people don't have the time, or is it a question of when they do engage as volunteers that the experience isn't convivial or enjoyable, and so on, and that actually it's changes in how people experience volunteering that are more important than freeing up time? So I come to Angela Ellis-Payne's question about how this more transactional approach about what the impact of that might be. Well, I would argue that one of the really important things about volunteering is the impact upon volunteers and the relational aspect of it and how it's a convivial experience. And I'm not sure you get that from those transactional approaches.
So there may be a trade-off there. Thanks, Carl. I wanted to come to a question from Charlie. I agree with the sustainability of volunteers and volunteer organisations. This can be difficult when a lot of funding opportunities are only project-based. It can be difficult for groups to apply for core funding. How can we influence policy funders to offer more core funding opportunities rather than just short to medium-term projects? Carl, do you want to just give a quick answer to that? And then anyone who's got any thoughts on that would be very welcome to hear those thoughts.
Policymakers have a very transactional view of volunteering in the voluntary sector, and they think that basically they're paying for inputs so that they can get outputs. And I think they have to be more realistic that you need to support the environment for volunteering more broadly. And that means that you're not necessarily going to be able to track what you get. And that suggests to me more grant funding rather than contract funding.
Great.
Yeah, Joe, I was just going to say the same. It's kind of, you know, almost frustration, certainly to me personally, that, for example, Scouts and Guides have hundreds of thousands, you know, 600,000-700,000 of children in effectively after school groups as part of the non-formal education agenda, and have no money at all from government. You know, kind of makes you wonder what kind of society we want to live in when that is the start for children. And so, I mean, we as chief execs in third sector organisations have a lot of conversations with government about this. But I think that there's so much that is left to charities and volunteers, and lack of recognition that we have probably one of the most developed third sectors in the world. I think moving to a third sector whereby it's become a substitute for the delivery of services paid for by contracts is a profound misunderstanding of what the sector is. I think the more that we can take advantage of the selfishness and selflessness which drives volunteering, and as a society support it as well as organisations, and I think that is the key challenge.
Really interesting, and that was of course echoed in the work that Dylan and Montserrat did about.
Sorry, Joe. One other thing is just in terms of funders. I mean, we've got a couple of really good funders, Pairs being one of them, People's Postcode Lottery being the other, who are very good in just actually choosing us as an organisation to partner with and supporting us and saying, you know best. And I think having more of that, with obviously checks and balances, but less of a log frame type approach, I think would actually be beneficial to everybody involved.
Yes, I guess that's a whole other area which we really haven't touched on today, but the type of evaluation that's done of initiatives and funding is probably really important in encouraging different approaches to funding and evidencing the value of that. I just want to come to a question from Sinead McKinley. During COVID, we saw some volunteers experience compassion fatigue. I think we need to be mindful of this, and for volunteers working with vulnerable groups, how do we ensure lived experience is embedded in volunteering? Anyone got any thoughts on that?
Joe, that's the first time I've heard the expression compassion fatigue in this context. What I certainly saw quite frequently were concerns about burnout and well-being, and I think we have to have a conversation about expectations about volunteering. And I mean, this is a common issue in disasters and emergency volunteering, the so-called 6-month wall after the initial sort of disaster hits and sort of people burn out. And I just think we have to be a bit more realistic about the fact that we have to care for volunteers' well-being, and it doesn't feel like a priority at times.
Thanks, Carl. Ashleen, I can see you've got your hand up. Would you like to come in?
Yeah, just this has been fantastic. It's not often I'm in forums with the rest of the UK, so it's been a great learning, and thanks for having me. I run a volunteer centre in Limavady. It's a small enough area. It's servicing about 40,000 in the bigger council area. That's 160,000. A week before we went into lockdown, we managed to gather, as I think it was 21 coordinators from 16 towns, hamlets and villages, with over 400 volunteers beneath them again. So we had a good strategic approach to it. But but the fatigue was the one thing that we were concerned about. So it was ensuring and training those the coordinators as well, to ensure that they were not, that their go-to people wouldn't be the same, that they would rotate the people that they were using. They would maybe change the rules if people were prescription lifting or whatever it is they were doing, that maybe the following few weeks later they would be befriending phone calls, you know, make the rules different as well. It's not just about giving them a break totally away, because people really wanted to be there and they really wanted to be doing something. So you wanted to make sure they had a meaningful experience. And it's been fantastic for us, because an awful lot of them are still volunteering, I have to say. Those that didn't go, you know, people who were furloughed, obviously we had great experiences with them, as did they, having never volunteered before. But now they have that, it's in their mindset. They had such a good feeling from it. Their own well-being was improved, that it's in their mindset to come back and do something again. And we've had them turn up and try events as a result of the experience that they had. But yeah, fatigue, definitely, it was the one thing that was so important to us at the beginning, whenever we were bringing it all together, is to ensure that the coordinators had it in their mindset to make sure that they rotated the roles, or that they give them a wee bit of, or they pushed them to have a wee bit of time off, because you really did have to push people not to volunteer. It was amazing what we seen, really, really was.
Amazing. Thank you, Ashleen. That was really good to hear about. We are coming to the end of the session. There are lots of questions we haven't got to. I'm sorry, but I can see Dylan and Mukjarat have been doing a fine job in getting to questions in the chat. So hopefully that's been useful and helpful to you. We have now got the report online, so there's a link in the chat to the report. And if anyone has ideas about the ways in which you'd like to engage with the work and the discussion in future, do get in touch. We're very keen to hear from people about ways we might take this conversation forward and extend the impact of the work. So if you have thoughts about that, do please contact us. But that just leaves me to thank Dylan, Mukjarat, Carl and Angela in particular, and all of you for participating this morning. It's been a really great conversation. Yeah, we look forward to engaging with you in the future.